Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malignant young puck dotting inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. You know, I got to make sure my hair is right every time I get on. You know, I can't have it all over the place. Anyways, so I have the round 8 game between Wesley and Hikaru Nakamura. You know, both U.S. champions. You know, of course, Hikaru Nakamura, former U.S. champion. Wesley current U.S. champion. But I forgot to say last video, but I changed my chess legend. So it is Vasily Ivanchuk. You know, he's played, you know, literally everybody since, like, I think the 70s-ish, late 60s, early 70s. He's been on the scene. You know, as you guys know, he's very famous for missing checkmate in 1 against, against Viswanathan Anand. If you guys have not seen that video, let me know in the comments and I will find the clip and post it for you. It was literally a checkmate in 1. All he had to do was take a rook in the corner and it was the end of the game and he missed it. I think it's very possible. I might show the game at some point one day. But I think that he just missed. There was a pawn disconnecting the rooks and he felt like maybe the rook was protecting the rook. I don't know, but the commentary on that game was insane. For those of you that have been around since like the beginning of my YouTube, I've mentioned the game before. But anyway, you know, he was actually world champion. Blitz and Rapid at one point, you know, so, you know, definitely a fearsome dude. He's pretty much beating everybody, man. It's like Kasparov, Karpov, Carlsen, pretty much everybody that's been anybody in chess over the past like 30, 40 years, he's gotten them. So, definitely a strong player. But if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. Let me make sure my volume's up. Every now and then I don't do it. Okay, cool. So we got D4, knight to F6. We have C4. E6, knight to C3. We have bishop to B4. So we do have the Nimzo-Indian defense here. We got E3. And, you know, like I always say, we're not worried about bishop takes, pawn takes. We're just going to have a gigantic clump of pawns in the center, which is not really what black wants to give white. So we have castles by black. Bishop comes to D3. And this is going to shock the crap out of you. I know. This move. C5. You guys are like, no, it's not. We know that's coming. Yeah, exactly. It's coming. We got knight to F3, D5. So we kind of have like a Tarrasch, you know, type of situation here a little bit. So pawn takes D5, pawn takes D5, pawn takes C5. And Nakamura opts to not take back the pawn immediately, but to go knight B to D7. And, I mean, you can do that if you want to. I mean, you know, there's nothing that's pretty much going to be protecting the pawn. It's going to drop, you know, no matter how you want to take it back. But bishop comes to D2. We see knight to C5. And this is placing a nice little attack on this D3 bishop. So we have bishop backing up to E2. Knight coming back to E6. And this is a very specific move. You do have I'll mention it a little bit later on, but you do have a reason why this move is played. And like I said, I'll get to it in a minute. Queen comes to B3. Bishop comes back to E7. We see castles by white. And then knight comes to C5 for black. And this is the novelty of the game. It's pretty interesting because it seems like such a natural move, knight to C5, because you are gaining a tempo on this queen. But queen comes to C2. We see knight C to E4. Knight takes E4, knight takes E4, and then we have rook F to D1. And to mention the move that I was talking about earlier, knight coming to E6, you know, black would really much like, when they have the isolated pawn on D5, they would very much like to try to control the square in front so that they can try to get a, you know, a pawn push in. But white doesn't allow that because they do come queen to B6, and they are placing a tempo on this bishop. And of course, if you trade, the bishop's going to trade and you have full control over this D4 square. But to mention further, rook F to D1. When you're playing against an isolated pawn, or a pawn that has the ability to try to advance, you know, you definitely do want to control the square in front of it. So at some point, possibly this bishop is going to come to C3, and you just have like all of these pieces clamping down on the D4 square. You want to try to make that pawn as dead as possible. And then, of course, you know, if you do have a passed pawn yourself, or an isolated pawn, you do want to control the square in front of it so you can try to push it. You want to have dynamic possibilities, you know, with an isolated pawn, and you want to minimize dynamic possibilities as the opposing person. So we do see queen to B6. Bishop comes down to E1. We see rook over to D8. We got A4. You know, of course, A5 is going to be coming, trying to knock that queen away. So bishop comes to G4, and we have A5. Now the queen has to move. So queen comes to f6. We see queen to b3. You know, tickling this pawn over here, you know, seeing what's good with it. Knight comes back to c5, and then we have queen to b4. And it might look kind of strange because you're like, why would I just place myself in the pin? Well, there's actually a very good reason behind this move, and it is because of this bishop on g4. There is some threats coming across, you know, so you don't intend to leave this queen on b4. So recognizing that, the bishop comes back to h5. We see bishop to c6, and not only are we gaining a tempo on the queen, but like I said, we are reinforcing the control of this d4 square. So we have not only the queen, the bishop, the knight, this pawn, and the rook all concentrated on this square. That d pawn is literally never going anywhere. So we see queen to d6, just adding to the pressure of this pin. And then we see rook a to c1, rook a to c8. We have bishop to d4. Pawn to b6, pawn takes b6, pawn takes b6, and we do have queen to c3. And it might look a little bit strange because you're like, man, you just keep putting your queen in one pin over, you know, over another. And we actually see black go queen to b8 in this position. But if we did, let's say we did try to take advantage of this pin that white put themselves in, there really isn't a good way to do it. Let's say you like try to like go knight to e4, and you're like, hey man, it's a free move because I'm placing the tempo on the queen. The queen would actually be just fine sacrificing itself on c8. And after rook taking c8, bishop back to f8, rook d to c1, you actually have two very nice rooks against this queen. This pawn is going to be dropping at some point. And I mean, you know, you're pinned here as well. So I mean, you just have a lot of compensation for the queen. So you definitely don't want to get into that. But like I said, we did have queen to b8. And then we had bishop up to e5, placing an attack on the queen. You have a queen down to b6, or queen down to b7, sorry. b4, knight comes to d7. You see bishop, bishop interestingly like lodging themselves into c7. Bishop takes on b4, and this is actually kind of a nice move because you're grabbing a pawn, but you're also trying to deflect the queen away. Queen takes on b4, rook takes c7. You see queen to e7. Rook d to c8. You see rook takes c7, rook takes c7. And then we have actually reached a point in the game that if you do want to guess what white plays here, go ahead and do so. Okay, so there's actually what we saw in the game, but then there's actually a better move than what we actually saw in the game. But if you guess bishop to a6, you would be absolutely correct. It is just, the main point of it is to try to deflect this queen away so that you can actually go queen to d8 with check. And then after the knight moves, which is the only move, the queen will be taken and you just won in exchange. You know, your structure is going to be damaged just a little bit after this. But like I said, you have won the exchange, and this pawn is definitely pretty weak. But we do see bishop to a6, and that allows queen to come to c6. If we back up, a rook takes d5 was actually a little bit better. You know, point being, you know, you grab a pawn in this variation, and also, you know, the queen definitely doesn't want to take because this is actually going to be dropping the queen. The queen is going to come up to d8 with the same idea as before, and the knight is going to have to cover, and then that's just going to be dropping your queen. So you definitely don't want to go into this. But you know, it was going to require black to play a little differently. But like I said, bishop to a6, we saw queen to c6. You know, knight came to e5, you know, like I said, the knight has to come back and defend f8. So this is trying to knock the knight away so that we could try to, you know, do one of these here and just win the game. So after knight came to e5, we actually saw queen to c2, giving a nice counter attack on this undefended rook down here. So pretty much we get to a point where, you know, we see all kinds of switches of moves. You know, queen comes to c6, we see knight to e5, and not, you know, what we kind of, I guess, would assume would come. You know, we see queen to c2, and rook comes to f1, and then we see knight to f8, queen comes to g5, and then we see bishop to e2. Bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, and then we have queen up to d8, and then queen comes to c2, just making sure that we hold on to that rook. You know, we do have, you know, maybe some possible threats on f7. So we don't want to be moving our rook anywhere. So we see h4. You know, at some point, white needs to give themselves a lift. Black is going to need to do this as well. We see queen to c5. Rook comes to d1. And there is an immense amount of pressure on this point. We actually see queen coming to e7, so this allows the trade, and this allows white to get one of their pawns back. So queen takes e7, rook takes e7, and then we see rook taking d5. We got f6 knocking that knight. We do see knight to c4, rook comes down to e4, knight takes on b7, and then rook takes on h4. And I mean, everything is fairly even. You know, not won by either side necessarily, but you know, we do kind of have an even game. We got f4, rook comes to h6, we see rook to d8, king comes to f7, we see rook back to a8, rook to h5, we see rook to a7 with check. You know, hoping that, you know, black will just kind of like, you know, take a nap and go like this so we can win a pawn and, you know, just win the game. But we do see rook, king back to g8. We see e4. So we're trying to restrict as much as possible, like the movements that black actually has. We see rook to b5, knight comes to d5. We see rook to b8, knight to e7 with check, king steps over. And there really isn't a lot that you can do as white. You know, of course, if you had... you know, if you had like two rooks, you know, you can do, I believe it's Anderson's mate, if I'm not mistaken, because these two squares are cut off. If you had like double rooks here or something like that, or you had a rook or a queen or something that could sacrifice itself on this square, getting too deep, you might have a little something, but you don't really have it here. So we got g3, knight comes to e6, we see king to f2, we got h5, you know, now, you know, black has given themselves some luft. Knight comes to h5. We see rook to b2 with check. King comes to f3. Rook to b3 with check. King comes to g2. We see rook to b2 with check. King comes to f3. Rook to b3 with check. King comes to f2. Rook to b2 with check. And king comes back to f3. And we do have a draw by threefold repetition. If I'm not mistaken. 1, 2, yes, threefold repetition. So they didn't agree to a draw. It was a threefold. So yes, I mean... This was actually a much more even game than the other games that Wesley So has gotten himself into. A lot of the other games that he's gotten himself into a draw, it's like he's literally getting beat. Like the game, he's losing the game, so he's been able to escape with the draw. This one was actually fairly even the entire time, with slight chances to each side, and you know, neither side was really losing. So I mean, it's a pretty fair result. Of course, we want to see some wins, but that's just not what we're encountering right now. So, I mean, that is what it is. So, for all of my people in the Philippines, let me get these good mornings real quick. So, maanyong buntag, mayad na agahan, naibeg na bigat, masantos ya kabasan, marhe na aga, buenos dias, maanyong aga, mapia na kapian kapano dios, mayap a abak, mayad na aga, mapia agay, mapia kapa pizza, my big abukla, marajana buntag, maria may not, malpe na aga, kasanyangan si ilabi, salam, assalamu alaikum, merci to you. Appreciate you guys for stopping by very much. Makita Tayo Mamaya, and I'll see you guys next time.